Glenn, how are you?
Very good, thanks. Yourself?
Good. There's a lot happening as always. One of the latest things, obviously we've talked in nauseam, I know you've probably talked about it a lot on your channel as well, regarding the attack on the gas field in Qatar, which we have to bring up because that's pretty significant. That's a pretty significant red line that was crossed. But I want to start with another development that happened a few hours ago. And that was the Supreme Leader himself in a statement saying that the attack on Turkey was a false flag attack. I don't know if you mentioned Azerbaijan and Cyprus as well, but I know he did say Turkey was a false flag attack. Did you see that statement? Again, it was by Mustafa himself in an audio statement.
No, so reference to it. I didn't watch it myself, though.
What do you think of that? Is it possible that it was a false flag attack? And why would he say that? Is it so for me, there's two theories. All three. One is Iran did it and they're walking back. The fact that they did it, they regret doing it. They're trying to de-escalate with those countries, number one. Number two, it was a rogue faction within the IRGC that did this because the command structure has been decentralized, especially in the original decapitation strike. In the heat of the moment, some commanders might have struck targets that they shouldn't have struck. And number three is it's actually a false flag attack by Israel, which is what the Supreme Leader is saying. But I'd just be shocked if Israel struck a NATO country. You know, Qatar is an ally of the US, but it's not a member of NATO. So for Israel to strike Turkey and label it as a false flag, as part of a false flag, seems pretty foolish for me. But, you know, you might disagree.
No, I actually think that would be the more likely one. I don't dismiss the other possibility. Oh, wow. It could have been, again, the Iran either did it deliberately or with the intention of making some damage, or it could just be a warning towards Turkey, but then, of course, attempting to walk it back doesn't have to be a regret. It can simply be to take pressure off the Turks that they don't have to retaliate. Of course, as you suggested, the second option would be in the chaos of the moment. They're launching a bit in all direction, quite literally. And but the third, I think, is the US and Israel attempting to find some proxy they can use to fight with, such as they got the Ukrainians, for example. And there's a lot of evidence towards this end. I mean, it was a similar attack on Azerbaijan, a strike which made very little strategic sense, which seemed to have the purpose of provoking. And later on, the Azerbaijanis, which were supposed to retaliate, walked this back as well. We saw the CIA arming the Kurds, attempting to pull them into this. We've heard now some reports in the media that the Americans are pushing, Jolani's Syria to intervene militarily, that is to attack Hezbollah in Lebanon. So it wouldn't surprise me if they were trying to get the Turkey over to take a more hostile approach towards Iran. But again, at this point, it's all speculations, but I think it's all quite likely. I don't see this restraint necessarily, because only the other things we've seen over the past few days is the attack on the Bushehr nuclear power plant. If this had hit the nuclear reactor, we could have a nuclear fallout. So I think, to go back only a couple of years now, the United States were willing to blow up the energy infrastructure of Germany and, well, the wider Europe, that is Nord Stream. So I don't see the massive restraint. I don't think the NATO as an institution is that important. It might have been, maybe Israel would have been more cautious, or the US during the under the Biden administration. But under this administration, the US has threatened to invade to annex Greenland, which is Danish territory. He threatened that he can use Spain's military bases without their permission. So I don't think that NATO is this holy cow, which many portrays it to be.
That is pretty insane. You're saying that there is a possibility it's a false flag with American approval as well, or is Israel acting on its own? I know we're talking as a hypothetical now, but would the US ever authorize for a strike, for a false flag against Turkey? Because I thought in today's age, the satellite imagery is available, the amount of intelligence available, being able to get away with a false flag is not what it was a few decades ago.
We don't have to go that far back. In 1990, the EU, they launched, this is after they discovered released the Operation Gladio documents in which they show that the US had, had this stay behind groups which had committed different attacks across Europe. The EU actually, what was the predecessor of the EU, the European Community, actually had statements coming out that the CIA and NATO had committed terrorist attacks around Western Europe, and with the effort of blaming it on the Soviets and various communist, sympathetic groups. So it's not as if one doesn't commit attack against one's own. I just want to make it clear. I have no evidence for what happened to Turkey, who sent that missile. But I think there was some statement on the Turkish side that said that this ballistic missile wasn't following the same trajectory as other missiles which had been launched. You can read, that's a very ambiguous statement. You can read what you want into it, but it's also something one might say if you suspect that it was not the Iranians who launched this. Again, this is a very dangerous war which the US and Israel have started. They both have a lot to lose from this. This is not something like attacking Yemen or Libya. So I think a lot of countries, they've gambled a lot on this and they're willing to take great risks.
All right, so let's take a step back and let's look at where the war is right now. We talked about the strike on the gas plants in the gas fields in Qatar and Iran. Obviously, Qatar was a retaliation for the strike on Iran. And there's also, you're talking about false flag, who did what, who authorized what. Everyone, I believe, Axios believes, New York Times believes, and people I speak to believe that Trump would have authorized a strike on the gas fields in Iran, because it is a pretty significant escalation. But Trump said he did not. Netanyahu said in a speech that Trump did not authorize it either. So first, why strike the gas field? What is the strategy there? And maybe give us your thoughts, Glenn, because it's been a while we haven't spoken, on the state of things right now. Because I speak to some people that are like, Mario, Iran's military is in shambles. We're getting rid of their commanders and their leaders on a daily basis. And then on the other side, I still see Iran retaliate within hours on a strike on their gas field, with a strike on Qatari gas field with significant damage within hours. And they continue to strike Israel with large warheads, with munitions, cluster bombs, and strike the Gulf on a daily basis while the Strait of Hormuz is closed. So on the counter argument, it seems that Iran is performing pretty well. So I would love to get your analysis of the situation as well.
No, I agree with your assessment. The attack on South Pars, this is very, very predictably caused this massive retaliation from Iran. Again, I think everyone would have predicted this. It's a lot that Iran can do. We can shut down and destroy the desalination plants across the Gulf states. They can attack all these oil fields and refineries, all these gas fields, all this which is quite vulnerable. It can also go after city centers if it would want to. I think that Iran sees that there is an escalation ladder because the US can carpet bomb all its facilities on Karg Island, or going after the South Pars gas field, which is the largest gas field in the world. But this is something. But if Iran goes all out against the Gulf states, then they would make no reason why the US wouldn't go after these targets. So I think they are simply saving it for going up the escalation ladder. If, for example, a nuclear power plant is destroyed and there's nuclear fallout, then I think all the desalination plants, that is the water of the Gulf states, will go away within the next couple of days. So I think this is how they envision going up the escalation ladder. No, I interpret Trump's position as, first of all, there's zero chance that the Israelis did this without the US approval. They're more or less joined at the hip here. So I think simply what Trump did is try to exercise escalation dominance. That is, he wants to go up, hit the gas fields in Iran. And what is it that you say if you don't want your adversary to retaliate? You say, well, it wasn't me. We want to start an energy war. We're not going to attack anymore. However, if you retaliate, then we're going to burn the whole thing down. This is usually what the US does when it wants to do a bloody nose attack. When it's, throughout history, bombed a little bit in Syria, Libya, Iraq. It would drop some bombs, and it's implied if you retaliate against some American bases, then you get smacked hard. So either you absorb this little blow, or we'll come back with bigger guns. And I think this is what they want to impose on Iran, put themselves in a position where they can fire upon Iran, but Iran won't respond. to a large extent, this is what NATO also set up in Ukraine. That is, we are now in a position where we can just attack Russia. We can supply, long-range missiles. We can give the targeting data. We can provide the satellites to guide them. We can have our intelligence agencies pick the targets, which are coordinates with what our war planners have put in place. And essentially, the Ukrainians don't have a single role in some of this. And the Russians can't do anything. They have to just retaliate against the Ukrainians. And this is, I guess what they want in Iran as well. But they didn't get this, obviously. The Iranians made it clear that they would retaliate fiercely. And this is important because, as the reason I brought up the Russian example, what happens with them and these Arab states, which have been bombed by the US in the past, if you don't retaliate, you don't have a deterrence anymore. So the Iranians' main priorities to survive is for countries to fear it. It has to have a deterrence. So it's very clear now, nobody doubts anymore if you attack, just drop a few bombs on Iran, it will go full out in its response. That's been the constant since the 28th of February. If you attack Iran, it will go back hard with everything. So I think this is what they're going with. And in terms of what Trump and the US, the Israelis say about the Iranians being decimated, we only had a few injured people, this kind of stuff. I think this, one doesn't assume that people will speak the truth. Instead, you would look for where the incentives are for propaganda in such a war. And this is a war where they're trying to exhaust each other, which means you want to deal pain to the other side, and you want to show that you're able to absorb pain. So all your propaganda is going to be organized around the idea that you're decimating your enemies. They're at the, almost collapsing while you have a few, injuries. If Iran hits Israel, it's just a couple of parked cars which were damaged, and some people possibly went to the hospital. While if you bomb Iran, you took out all their military capabilities and their whole leadership. This is kind of how your political or communication should be in a war situation. And again, very predictably, and that's what you see as well. So I wouldn't take it too literally what they're actually saying.
Do you think Iran's strategy of retaliation, tit for tat, as there have been, is working? Because on one side, it should deter future attacks, but we're seeing, we saw Israel strike the oil depots, and now we've seen Israel strike the gas field. But it could also turn the Gulf nations against Iran. We've seen the statements they made in Saudi, which is fascinating. When they were meeting in Saudi, Iran was striking Riyadh as well while the Gulf leaders they were meeting. So I don't know what message they're trying to send. Are they trying to send a message saying, don't you dare attack us? We could get you anywhere. Or they're trying to, because Gulf nations saw it as a way to close the door on diplomacy. And that's another way of saying it. Like, we don't want to talk. There's no diplomatic discussion until the war ends. So I'd love to get your thoughts on whether the strategy of tit for tat could backfire, number one, and number two, what you make of the strikes on Riyadh while the Gulf countries were meeting, and the statements by the Gulf countries, especially Saudi, which was very hawkish and made threats again.
Well, I think, first regarding the ongoing escalations by US and Israel, I think they still, their goal is to exhaust Iran to the max the degree as possible. But of course, what you want to do is still be able to drop bombs, weaken its economic potential, stir up social unrest. You still want to try to knock out the leadership, its military capabilities, while encouraging them not to respond in kind. But Israel and the US, they're in this for regime change and the destruction of Iran. So they will continue down this path, but they will, of course, attempt to limit the retaliation by Iran. Regarding Iran's retaliation, then I do think that they face a dilemma. On one hand, they can't strike American military bases in the United States. So what are they supposed to do when they're surrounded by all these Gulf states which host American troops, and these Gulf states are being used to launch attacks on Iran? How would they not attack these bases? So first they go after the bases, but also I think they believe that the Saudis are encouraging some of these attacks as well. Or at least the initial attack, and for this reason, Perhaps they were sending a message. Again, I'm just speculating here, but in terms of how the Gulf states would react, I very much agree with you. I think it could go both ways. On one hand, this could fuel the anger and cement the relationship between these Gulf states and the US. On the other hand, it could also go the other way, which is how the Iranians, I guess, are hoping it will go, which is that these Gulf states will conclude that the security partnership with the United States is a source of insecurity, not a source of security. But if you ask whether or not it can backfire, I think, yes, certainly so.
Because on the Gulf countries, just I'm not sure if you saw this, Glenn, earlier today, the UAE reaffirmed a $1.5 trillion investment in the US and plans to buy more air defense systems. So it came out earlier today. And there's another one here. The US just flooded the Gulf with $23.5 billion in weapons in a single day. The State Department approved $16.5 billion in military sales to the UAE, Kuwait, and Jordan. Then another $7 billion in unannounced deals to the UAE alone, including $5.6 billion in Patriot missiles and Chinook helicopters. And the UAE is also getting AMRAAM, air-to-air missiles, F-16 upgrades, THAAD integrated radar, anti-drone systems, and now Patriots. Kuwait got missile defense radar, so Jordan as well. So essentially, we've got the Gulf arming, and they're arming by buying from the US. And we're not seeing any discussions of any deals to buy military equipment from Russia or anywhere else. I know the US has the best military equipment, but going in there during the war and buying American military equipment says something, no? Or do they have no choice because this is the military equipment they have, so that it takes a while to pivot to another supplier?
No, well, I think it's deliberately from the United States. This is how alliance system works. That is, the US provides security for them, and in return, they have some political loyalties, they have economic loyalties in terms of, for example, selling their oil in dollars, and also in the military sphere that they buy American weapons, at least primarily so. So I think that's quite natural, but I think they have some short-term and medium-term consideration. I think the short-term is they need weapons. They both see Iran as being the main threat now, given that Iran is attacking all of them. But the more medium-term, I think, or long-term is they know what Iran is trying to do. That is, it's trying to divide them. So, for example, when the Arab states complain that all the best air defense are going to Israel, or they keep getting the message is because you host the Americans that you're being bombed now. They know that the objective is to divide them. So what you want to do perhaps is then communicate the exact opposite, that now they're closer than ever. They will commit more to the US, that is to send more money, investments to the US. The Americans will deliver more weapons to them and essentially reaffirm the partnership. And that's likely the case. But in the long run, I think it could change. But there's also a concern if they defragment, if they say, well, the US has to go, what are the alternatives? Because you can say, yes, that the world becomes a bit more dangerous when you host American bases. But if the Americans leave, the Iranians will be the main regional power. And they will likely ask for reparations from the Gulf states as well. Otherwise, they will probably be denied access through the Strait of Hormuz. So there's a lot of reasons why they should continue the military partnership against Iran. But
maybe, Glenn, there's a good argument to be made. I know me and you and others are saying that the American base is what brought the Gulf nations insecurity. One could also make the argument the American bases in those countries are what brought those countries security and allowed them to flourish for so many decades. So what we're seeing right now, the impact that we're seeing on those Gulf countries, comes after decades of these countries becoming economic powerhouses. And the reason they were able to do that within that security bubble is because of the American bases. So maybe we shouldn't dismiss the value of these American bases. And maybe it's a bit too much wishful thinking to think that Iran's request for these bases to pull out of the Middle East, of the Gulf, has any chance of going through, even long term.
No, well, like I said, it could go both ways. I don't dismiss that this could link these countries closer to the US. It could also divide them further. But, we have another war going on at the same time with a lot of similarities, which is the war against Ukraine. And once Russia invaded Ukraine, a lot of experts across the West were saying, well, Russia wanted less NATO. Now NATO is stronger than ever before. But within the first days of the war, as Russia invaded, you had also other people like Colonel Douglas MacGregor, which I know you have interviewed, who said the exact opposite, saying, well, this is going to kill NATO, because the conclusion will eventually come through that it's NATO, which for a long time gave security, is now institution which essentially creates the insecurity which it's now has a reason to exist to resolve. So it's dealing with the security concerns caused by its own existence. And I think this is also true with what you said with the Gulf states. I don't disagree that the United States, through this alliance system, provided security for a while. But again, the point of departure in international security tends to be the recognition of the international anarchy, which means that the international system consists of many states which compete for power. So when you build security, be it weapons or these alliance systems, yes, it provides security, but it can also create insecurity for the others. So if the US builds a lot of missiles today, it has security, but it causes insecurity for China. Then China has to develop weapons, and then that causes insecurity for the US. So, this is the whole point of the security dilemma, which we find in the security competition. So it can go both ways. I do think that in the 90s, though, when the US was a comfortable, stable hegemon, it was leaning more towards security because no one could challenge it, and the US was more relaxed given that it had dominance. Now that it's a declining hegemon, it has a lot of incentives to knock out rivals, be it Russia, Iran, China, in order to restore its dominant position. So I think it's quite also now more likely for the frontline states, be it the South Koreas of the world, the Gulf states, or the Europeans, that what was security in the past becomes now more insecurity because the security competition shifts towards them becoming, activated, not be protected anymore, but be used as frontline states against America's rivals.
Very good point. And look, taking back to the discussion we talked earlier about this being a false flag attack, what would be the objective of Israel and the US, or just Israel, depending on which theory you want to go with, to conduct a false flag attack like this, to strike Cyprus, Azerbaijan, and Turkey, especially Turkey, and try to blame it on Iran? Is it to try to drag Turkey into the fight? Do they really expect Turkey to fight Iran militarily? Because I don't think anyone with a reasonable mind would tell you that Turkey is going to respond to an attack like this militarily. I just don't see the strategic reason or the strategic value of such a false flag.
Well, it can be. No, I don't think Turkey going directly into the war is likely, but you have different degrees of participation. It can be simply political cohesion within the American-led bloc that they kind of fall in line. They recognize, Iran is the main threat, so they reduce their criticism against Israel. It could be more casual military assistance that is, using its intelligence, its airports for refueling, its airspace if the US wants or Israel wants to, for some reason, use this part, get the Turks to use its influence over Azerbaijan. It's hard to say. Again, one delves into speculation, but there's always reason why having a huge country like Turkey with its massive army to be aligned with you as opposed to having sympathies with the opponent.
Do you think Trump is in a position now, a point of no return, where he is not able to get out of the war anymore? Because we've talked on so many chats that we've had, we've talked about, will Trump off-ramp? Will he tackle? But I feel like there's a stage where he cannot tackle anymore. He's in too deep. Are we at that stage yet?
Yeah, I think he would have liked to pull out if it didn't work. I think what happened in Yemen, for example, back last year, would have been the ideal scenario. That is, he goes in, it didn't work out as he wanted. They obviously weren't going to defeat Yemen, so what did they do? They just, he declared victory and went home. And then everyone forgot about it. I think this would have been the ideal approach. I think he's been boxed in here because really, what can he do now? It looked like he was going for a similar path. That is, is making the point that we killed their leadership, we destroyed their navy, their army, all their economies in ruins. We brought death and destruction. We won. We set back the nuclear program like 30 years. Whatever he wants to say to declare victory and go home. But it doesn't work that way, because he doesn't get to decide when the war is over, and Iran will still then have the Strait of Hormuz closed, and then the victory is not very convincing at all. So the Iranians, they're a little bit like the Russians now. They don't want a ceasefire. They want a political settlement. They want to make sure that this doesn't happen again, that the Americans and Israelis don't simply regroup, replenish their weaponry, and then come back a few months from now. So again, he's in a difficult spot. I mean, if you would advise Trump now, what can you tell him to do? Because he can't go home, because the Iranians will continue to drain the US by weakening its bases, so this won't happen again, to limit access of its proxies or frontline states to the Strait of Hormuz. And if he goes home also without this thing solved, he's finished. So he has to find a way of defeating Iran, but how do you defeat him? How do you open up the Strait of Hormuz? Is all this?
So I think that if I was giving advice to Trump, I'd probably be the last person he needs advice from. But I would say he does have the escalation letter against Iran. They do have, to an extent, a superiority. So he could strike. He could tell Iran behind the scenes that I need an off-ramp, and then if you don't give me an off-ramp, I'm going to keep escalating, continue striking your military bases, decapitating your leaders, strike some of your energy, strike more of your energy, strike your oil depots, strike your bridges, strike your whatever next thing you want to, your media, the various news outlets. So continue striking and escalating till Iran's like, all right, we're ready to end the war now. So that would be one way for him to off-ramp without Iran, with it making sense for Iran as well. Because I understand Iran needs to deter future aggression, but there comes a stage where Iran needs to also maintain, it doesn't want to become a failed state. And the US, if it wants to, could bomb Iran into becoming the next Syria. So that is one way for the US for Trump to be able to end the war and to off-ramp. I don't think it's that difficult for him to off-ramp, because while Iran has the upper hand with controlling the Straits, striking the Gulf, exceeding expectations in terms of the number of drones and missiles fired, they still have the world's biggest air force flying above them on a daily basis and the world's biggest navy off their shore.
No, I think you're probably correct in this. And I think that this will probably be the advice he's getting as well, because what else can he do now? If he can't go home and there's no clear way of winning this war, in terms of knocking out a leader or, sinking some warship, this isn't going to end the war. So I think this is probably what he communicated to the Iranians, which would explain some of the escalations we see, which is, we're willing to look for an off-ramp. And there's been some indications in the media that he's indeed looking for an off-ramp. But if it's not, so on one hand, you offer the off-ramp, and if you don't take it, we're going to go up the escalation ladder, assuming that the US has escalation dominance until it's sufficient pain for the Iranians. I think what he didn't calculate is that the two things. One would be that the Iranians see this as being unacceptable simply because they can't afford to have the US come back again in a few months. But second, I'm not sure they are convinced that the Americans have this escalation dominance in terms of the ability to go up that escalation ladder. Because if they go up this ladder, the Gulf states might just disappear if they have no water, if they have no energy, if all the expats leave. So they can simply make it impossible for them to recover. And for Iran, that would essentially be what they're aiming for. They don't need the Gulf states to voluntarily decouple from the US if they simply can never recover again. So I think that the Iranians so far, they seem confident that they can afford to go up this escalation ladder if that results in the US being expelled from the region. So the more pain the US brings to Iran, the more they can expel the US from the region. Again, I'm not sure if this is how each side are thinking, but as I said, I agree. I think this is the most likely or the only scenario which I can see or strategy that the Americans are following.
By the way, just came in now, Glenn, as we wrap up, breaking. Iraq declares force majeure on all oil fields developed by foreign oil companies, according to Reuters. And we've seen a lot of companies starting to worry about their energy needs in Asian countries. I think there was a report that Malaysia and China stopped exporting, let me see where it is, stopped exporting diesel to one other Asian country. I can't remember if it's Vietnam. And that caused a severe issue there where they have to reduce the number of flights they have. So Asia's starting to suffer, already starting to feel the consequences of the war that, that had nothing to do with, they never wanted. And let me see where, let me see if I have, I'll read it out before we wrap here, because I think it's an important story, because all these factors play a role in what happens next. Vietnamese authorities have warned the country's aviation industry to prepare for potential flight reductions from after April, so next month, after China and Thailand halted exports of jet fuel due to the Iran war, increasing the likelihood of shortages. So there we are, the repercussions of the war, and Iran's strategy, one could argue, is working, because all these countries will go to Trump, pressure the US to end the war. So one could say that some indications that Iran's strategy may be working, which is good news, because it means Trump would seek an off-ramp. Anything to end the war, whether it's Trump seeking an off-ramp or otherwise, is good news. But Glenn, absolute pleasure as always. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you. Pleasure's mine.